a special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark, Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of archaeology in the Middle East to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, joined with two other colleagues from La Sierra University, Larry Garrity, former president, and continuing to work in a number of capacities in the support of archaeology and biblical archaeology, and Kent Bramlett, who is the Associate Professor of Archaeology and the History of Antiquity at La Sierra. We have worked together for a couple of decades, Larry and I longer, but the three of us back 20 years in archaeology, and we share a love for that as well as for the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament. That has been part of our education and training and interest as well. So we're dealing with the book of Deuteronomy, and we're in the second of 3 episodes on Deuteronomy. And this time, the largest section of the book, and we'll look at the outline in a minute, on the laws, basically the stipulations of the covenant, of the agreement, of the relationship between God and his people. What does the name Deuteronomy do for you? I mean, is that a favorite book? Is that an important book? Is that a book you would recommend others read? What do you think?
Sounds a bit legal. Second law, it's like the second constitution. Would you want to sit down with that? A lot of people did and do. It's the third most quoted book in the New Testament. I think people found it surprisingly, to many of us, surprisingly full of hope, of direction. The Torah means, it's from the word to shoot, so you think of it as pointing the direction to go. Now, it was a hopeful idea in the ancient world.
So for people living in chaos, not a bad idea.
Right.
Not a bad idea to put one's life together, head off in a direction that was meaningful and productive and rewarding. And so it's good news. And it seems to be a good book to read. Would it have anything to do with how it's couched, how it's framed? You've mentioned before that this is maybe the most theological book, of the Pentateuch?
Well, I think the argument can be made for the whole Old Testament, that it provides the founding document for telling the history of Israel, and is the blessings and curses. It's really the following or the obedience of those laws set out to us in Deuteronomy that determine the future of Israel. And there are certain things which hold back the disaster which is impending, because there might be one good king, and that provides a little bit more time.
And according to the history, based on the theology of Deuteronomy, in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, how many of these kings actually do pass muster? What, 2?
None of the north.
None in the north,
none
in the kingdom of Israel.
Hezekiah, Josiah, well, Jehoshaphat, I think.
Right. But not a lot.
Not many.
But maybe enough for some hope?
For some hope.
That's what I heard you say.
Yeah.
So,
And then when disaster does hit, Deuteronomy during the exile provides the whole way for the exiles to deal with this catastrophe. And then to read the possibility of repenting and turning back again, this possibility of restoration, which they see then in the reestablishment of the temple in Jerusalem.
I think it's challenging to see in the exile basically the total collapse of theology. Deuteronomy is a way to put something back together. The total collapse of theology at the beginning of the exile left this vacuum, and out of that vacuum comes a spate of tremendously creative theological works, many of them based on this whole principle, and certainly all of them based on hope. So you may have something there, Kent.
And Christians, the end of the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, the end of the temple, thinking about what this means and reformulating the whole identity of Christianity then for the world, I think also ties into Deuteronomy.
I really like the book of Deuteronomy because it sort of summarizes the message of the Pentateuch in a series of sermons that go back to Mosaic times. And it's a very practical book, full of instruction. And you get the feeling like we're coming out of a difficult period and we're heading into a bright future, and here's what we could do to make it that way, you know.
You use the word sermon to define basically the literary genre. I mean, that seems to be what it is. It's this personal speaking to people. It's like we've gathered here, and here's what I would like to talk to you about. With a sermon, what do we get? And what do we don't get? What do we not get? Or what should we not expect in a sermon? What should we expect and what should we not expect in a typical sermon?
Well, plot, maybe. Some sense of progression of narrative. It's meant to be listened to be heard. And I think that's the difference from Exodus. It's not really put together to be read out. You can, but it's also a document of important facts.
But having some kind of narrative line, something that keeps attention. A sermon, good sermons do that.
Very different from Leviticus, which we've talked about, you know, in this series. Lists and laws and things like that. But Deuteronomy has that human touch to it. Yeah.
I think what I was getting at with my former question too, I mean, on the positive, yes. On the other side, do we expect preachers to take some liberties in telling the stories? I mean, I don't mean to say make mistakes and so on, but to
you
point
give
out
illustrations
lessons.
and point out lessons and so on. Have
So
little windows.
Should we allow for the book of Deuteronomy that kind of flexibility and that kind of freedom? That we have a passionate preacher who wants to win these people over in ways that not only capture their attention, but as you mentioned, capture the attention of Israel over and over again as they meet different kinds of disasters, even into the New Testament period. But always kind of coming out at the end, there is reason to hope. I mean, that's what a sermon's supposed to do, right? So you frame the story. And as we have in the outline in our slides, the first sermon that we talked about in our last episode, chapters 1 through 4, and then the one we talk about for this episode, the law, the stipulations, and then the covenant, which is a term we need to come back to, and we will in a minute. And then we have these appendices at the end. Before we go directly to this, though, I wanted to mention this because we were talking about it and the nature of a sermon. We have 3 sermons here, but framed all together with another guiding principle, and we'll come to that. But before we do that, let's think about what's in front of us on the table. We have artifacts. These are not just props. These help us understand something about life in the time of Deuteronomy, the history there. So what do we have?
You know, we think that Moses belongs in the late Bronze period during the 13th, 14th centuries, something like that. And all of these things he could have looked at and he could have used because they come from that period. And it's exciting to think that here before us are objects that are, 3,500 years old, maybe, something like that.
Contemporary with Moses.
Contemporary with Moses and the Israelites, that's right. So when they talked about a jar or about a flask, these are the kinds of things that they had in their minds because that's what they were used to using.
And then we have some other artifacts over here. Larry, you have described this one before as it's kind of a miniature of the Code of Hammurabi. So we are going to be turning to his code.
And you know, Hammurabi, this Babylonian king, we know erected these stela, a large monument, in several different places in his kingdom with the law code there, so the people knew what was expected of them.
And illustrated
it. How he got it, right.
That's right, and how he got it. And all these laws come from
from
above,
right.
from the deity. And you have described two kinds in the past, Larry, two kinds of laws. Apodictic laws, which are given without needing a reason, and then case laws, which grow out of life experiences. And we have both of those in Scripture, and all of them come from God, again, to give this
So the one kind
life.
are the thou shalt do or not do something, and then the others are, well, if this happens, then you do that.
Right. And many of the if this happens, as we look at the illustrations, come from life in the land. They're agricultural, and they're people living in villages. And so there's some sense that they were certainly intended for life as, life in the promised land, as the Bible.
And we shouldn't be surprised if many of those are shared by other people in other cultures around Israel.
And they come when they're needed.
Yeah, right.
But
Most countries nowadays have driving laws, things that are relevant to life as we know it.
Right. And then a couple of other artifacts here, metal and stone.
A sword and a dagger.
Right. And these actually are going to mean something more when we turn to the book of Joshua and Judges, where we have lots of battles. When we have some battles going on in the Pentateuch, but not so much as in Joshua and Judges. Okay, let's think then again about what is on the screen. We've talked about this outline, and then we need to think now about law codes, because this is the second sermon. It is a long list of regulations, some of which are more applicable to our life today, some of which don't seem to be. So what is it we need to think about here? What is Torah? You talked about it already as like kind of shooting something.
Right, the root comes from the idea to shoot, and so the noun, the idea of aiming and the direction to go.
Right.
Instruction is another way to translate Torah, isn't it?
Right. And in the Old Testament, you have these wild passages like Psalm 19. Give me Torah over the finest gold you can find. I mean, who would think they want another stipulation, another regulation, another rule? Well, in this mindset of God's gift, His good gift to His people, to order their lives, to give them structure and meaning, this is to be celebrated.
We can compare it maybe to a railing around the balcony. So if you stay within the confines of the railing, you're not going to fall off or not going to have trouble. And so the instructions, the Torah, is like that railing for you.
In the New Testament, I do think for Protestant Christians, building on the Lutheran theological traditions, that law has taken on a negative kind of cast. And that's unfortunate. I do recall reading a book by Ronald Hals, a Lutheran, who wanted to persuade his Lutheran friends that law is not a bad thing. And he goes to, in fact, it's faith and grace in the Old Testament. And he talks about this as celebrated, as a very happy kind of thing. But in the New Testament, we at least do have some sense of a difference between how people are saved, whether by law or by grace. I don't think the Old Testament would ever draw that distinction.
No.
So
even today, conservative or Orthodox Jews celebrate what's called Simchat Torah. That's the celebration of the giving of the law, and it's a very joyous occasion. I mean, there's dancing.
The joy of.
Yes, the joy of. Right.
That's the name.
Yeah.
Right. And then we could think about law codes. We have lots of law codes in the Old Testament. What do we have in the New Testament for law codes?
I had to think for a while, but I guess the Jerusalem Council, they
In
come
Acts
together.
15?
Yeah, when they come together to decide which Old Testament laws Christians are indebted to keep, they can only come up with, 4?
I think so.
And it seems that a couple of those were put to the side
Since then.
since then.
Right.
And of course, the early Christians, many of them were Jews, and so they were familiar with that sort of background of law. But they were living at a time when the Romans promulgated their own laws that have their own history, don't they?
Right.
Yeah.
So we think about the influence of law to modern times. I mean, of course.
And of course, Paul is noted for talking about the law and how binding it is and whether it is and so forth. I mean, law and grace is something that he specialized in.
No, I mean, I wouldn't say that we're talking about the Jewish traditions, not simply Christian behavior, which you have that expectation of moral behavior.
Right. Now, we do have not only law codes, but treaty formulations from Egypt and from the Hittites. We'll come to those in a minute, and from the Assyrians. And the components of these treaties were actually quite similar. And so, but the Hittites is the clearest, and so we're going to take a look.
This means that those three surround Israel, don't they? The Hittites were north of Israel, the Egyptians were south, and the Assyrians were to the east. Yeah.
Hittite suzerainty or sovereign treaty between a sovereign king and the vassals, smaller entities, state entities. And how are they formulated? This is the first half. What do we have?
Well, the preamble identifies the parties involved. So that'd be sort of a listing of who this is agreements between. The prologue lists deeds, the deeds already performed by the suzerain on behalf of the vassal. It's an interesting way to start. We don't usually start our laws with all the good things that the power has done for those under it.
That's right.
The stipulations, then what terms are to be upheld, what is basically the heart of the terms of the treaty. Provision for annual public reading. I guess now reading, the ability to read among the common public would replace that to some extent.
Right.
But this is important in those times. Read it before the people.
And that's how people transmitted information primarily.
And the divine witness to the treaty. I remember at least the Hittite laws had thousands at the later Hittite times. They tried to list every deity they could think of, and they had quite a lot.
And they all had to be witnesses.
They all had to be witnesses.
Interesting.
Blessings, this is very, I think, interesting. Blessings if the stipulations of the treaty are upheld, and curses if the stipulations are not upheld. And then finally, a sacrificial meal that sort of
seals the deal.
Seals it.
Food seals the deal. So something very significant about these sacred meals. And now in treaty, a treaty that everybody would have known about, and which now is the cast for the book of Deuteronomy, which now says, okay, God is our suzerain, here's what he's done, now we do this. And
so it's interesting to think of the Ten Commandments in that light, and the Ten Commandments would merely be the stipulations of that whole treaty.
Right. As a part of a whole, not
as part of a whole, not set up by itself. No,
it needs to be part of the whole. It's a context, and meaning comes from context.
It does.
In the interpretive principles that we use for biblical studies. I have several law codes dating across the spectrum of 1,000 years here. We're going to turn to some parallels between Deuteronomy and all of these. So we'll just look at them and just think about some connections, what might be comparable, what might be in contrast. So let's do that. Larry, we're in the Code of Ur-Nammu. Read Article 6 for us.
So Ur-Nammu was a king that came from Mesopotamia, and roughly contemporary with the Late Bronze Age that we're talking about when Moses lived. So Article 6 in his code says that if one citizen rapes a woman who is marriageable and is engaged to another citizen, the sentence is death. Now compare that to Deuteronomy 22, which says, if there is a betrothed virgin and a man meets her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of the city, and you shall stone them to death with stones, the young woman because she did not cry for help.
Would this go well today?
Not very well.
I don't think so. There are contextual things. We're actually going to come back to this because there are other laws that say if the woman is on the mountains with her friend, or if she's inside of a house, or if she's in a place where she could be heard. So there are principles, different kind of principles governing this and the outcome.
Of course, they're assuming that you could hear if someone was calling for help. That's the assumption. We might beg to differ, but in traditional villages, A believer was talking recently about living in the village in Cyprus. He can hear everything that's going on with the neighbors. And so you would hear much more easily than in modern
And
towns.
I wonder if there isn't something in what you just said that would help us understand why there are so many laws in the Pentateuch about sexuality and about sexual relationships. I mean, you've got problems with fathers and children, you've got uncles, and you've got males and females, you've got all kinds of things. I wonder how much of that grows out of this living in close proximity.
If you were to, I suppose, separate those out, you'd have a large proportion of the laws of Deuteronomy that relate to that.
Right. And I wonder if living conditions didn't dictate
Sure.
why the weight is here. And maybe how much damage sexual misbehavior creates.
And family is important, isn't it, in the Hebrew Bible? And so all of these laws are meant to try to protect family.
Protect and honor.
And honor, right.
Kent, still in the Code of Ornamu, Article 17.
Okay, if a slave flees the household in the city of one citizen, and another returns the slave, then the slave owner shall pay a reward of 2/3 ounces of silver.
Okay, how does that compare with Deuteronomy?
You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place which he shall choose within one of your towns, where it pleases him best. You shall not oppress him.
Similarities, differences. One of them is assuming the return. The other one, is this one of the texts that the abolitionists used?
I think they did, yes.
To violate laws of state and not send them back. We're going to see some other varieties of that as well. Again, must have been fairly common. We don't have slaves, at least I don't. And so these laws are really quite foreign to us. And so it's this kind of context that helps. Larry?
If a citizen is guilty of perjury, the fine is 5 ounces of silver. And then in Deuteronomy it says, if a malicious witness rises against any man to accuse him of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who were in office in those days. If the witness is a false witness, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother.
Slightly different.
Yeah.
How would we know if a witness is a false witness? There actually are
There are tests, aren't there, in the Old
and some of them
Testament?
are trial by water. I mean, we think about the Salem witch trials, and some of those derive from the biblical world. And so they're
Trial by ordeal.
by ordeal.
The
And
ancient form of waterboarding, right?
well,
Yeah.
in a strong sort of way.
See, how did it go? If the person died,
That's right.
or if they survived, they were guilty. If they died,
That's
well, they were
right.
innocent.
That's
but
Right.
Okay, Kent, we shift now to the Sumerian code. They've probably, the first writing comes from Sumerian?
It does, yeah. And it was interesting, I think, to archaeologists and ancient historians, or historians of the ancient world, that Hammurabi is not this, he didn't create all of these laws, but they go back, and then these other earlier law codes were found.
Right.
And so he's really just codifying.
That's right.
And we think that the Sumerians were the ones who developed the kind of writing that we call cuneiform, because of the kind of mud that they had and the reeds that they used, clay, and so on.
If a son disowns the father and mother of his household with the oath, "You are not my father, you are not my mother," then he forfeits his right to inherit their land and property, and can be sold as an ordinary slave at full market value.
Okay, now let's think about this. So, if a son says, I really don't want to do anything more with you, they can force him into slavery.
They can sell him.
But at least get a good price, right?
For a good price.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. So where does Deuteronomy take us?
If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones.
Oh.
So, where would you rather live in the context of this particular law?
A live dog is better than as a go than a dead lion.
Right. I have heard people say, reading the Bible, trying to take it seriously and directly, that we would have a lot less juvenile delinquency if we actually followed this law. I'm not sure that's where we ought to go with it. But
ISIS is doing in Syria. It's going back to these old laws and trying to live very literally in the 7th century.
And I think it's worth asking ourselves when we talk about let's read the Bible literally and let's do what it says, you know. Are we always going to do that? Or do we pick and choose what to be literal about?
Or do we work systematically and intelligently at interpretive processes and principles that will actually teach us the lessons that were intended originally? We have work to do.
Commentators acknowledge that ISIS is the most consistent, yes, in the application of
in
their
the literal
ancient law.
application of these laws. Okay, on that thought, let's go to another one of Sumerian, Larry.
If one citizen rapes the daughter of another, who with the knowledge of the father and the mother of her household is walking about the city, then the citizen, if he swears at the sanctuary gate that he did not know she was a daughter of a household, is not guilty.
Okay, now you've already read the Deuteronomy one, so if she's in the city, I put this here because I wanted the city, the parallel with the city, but it goes in a different direction than we expect, and so he can plead ignorance and somehow get away with it. Kent.
If a judge accepts a bribe to render and seal a decision, then the judge is fined 12 times the settlement ordered in the decision, is expelled from the bench, and cannot serve as a judge again.
It's pretty serious.
It is.
Okay, what happens in Deuteronomy?
You shall not pervert justice, you shall not show partiality, and you shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous.
No punishment indicated, but nevertheless, we don't do this.
The dangers of the bribes is very evident.
And so we have these principles that just go across all of these law codes. Let's take a look at a couple more. Okay.
Code of Hammurabi there, which is on the table here, the little...
Right, in the miniature.
Yeah, miniature. If a citizen helps state slaves or household slaves to escape, then the sentence is death.
Now, then we go back to Deuteronomy. We've already read the Deuteronomy part. Okay, I think we'll do one more. Kent, read us the articles.
There's a slavery one. If a citizen harbors slaves who have run away from the state or from a household, and if the citizen disobeys a court order to extradite them, then the sentence is death.
So this is fairly significant and fairly weighty.
We can see slavery is a big part of their society.
It is. Sexual laws and slavery, too, as we think about it. Well, thank you, Larry and Kent. And thank all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope this has provided something for you to think about and to add to your faith, and we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient. Keep believing and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.